And then welcome everybody. We're really glad you're here. This is the Floating Offshore Wind Roadmap group, and particularly the Marine Spatial Planning Workgroup. So if folks remember, between now and kind of June-ish, the overall Roadmap Roundtable is working to advise Department of Land Conservation and Development on a roadmap around floating offshore wind. And as part of that, we defined some particular areas where a deeper dive or some particular strategy could be helpful. And the roundtable folks said something around marine spatial planning, whether that's planning for all sorts of things, but looking at the geography and the space and the unique aspects of different parts of Oregon's oceans. How do we combine and think about multiple uses and avoiding conflicts and all that kind of stuff? So that's what we're here today to talk about. This is the first meeting of that Marine Spatial Planning work group. So we'll get a chance to kind of re-up a little bit on what our scope is and think about, well, when we've done marine spatial planning before, whether it's for undersea cables or marine reserves or territorial sea plans, or even running some of BOEM's models on the past call areas, what have we liked about that? What have we not liked about it? What would we do differently? This group is not likely to actually do the marine spatial planning in the next 4 months, but instead would kind of scope that out. So that's a bit of the overview for the agenda. Jeff, we've got kind of a small group here. Should we just do a quick round of introductions before I hand it to you?
Yeah, why not?
Why not? So can we I'll just go with who I can see here. So maybe we go Scott and then Jessica and Julia. I'm Bobby Cochran with Oregon Consensus. Scott?
Yeah, I'm Scott. I'm with the Oregon Fishermen's Cable Committee. We work out of an office in Astoria, but we're sort of a statewide organization, state coast-wide organization. So we have our fishing industry members are range from the whole West Coast commercial fisheries. So primarily trawlers, crabbers are not covered by our organization, although many draggers and shrimpers also crab. So we do represent quite a few fishing industry people, and we work primarily to make sure that conflicts between fishermen and cables are avoided.
Jessica and Julia?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jessica Carlton. I'm an affiliate with NOAA's National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, or NCOS, and I am the Pacific Regional Marine Planning Coordinator for the Marine Spatial Planning team at NCOS. And so I led the suitability modeling that was conducted with BOEM for the Oregon call areas last year. And our team has been working with BOEM across the nation to help cite offshore wind energy, but our team also works in other areas such as the aquaculture opportunity areas, and then we've also worked with sanctuaries in other areas of conservation. So happy to be here. Nice to meet everyone.
Hello, Julia DeGraw. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Senior West Coast Campaign Manager for the National Wildlife Federation on the Offshore Wind Energy team. And I'm the official roadmap or roundtable roadmap member for our organization. But I just wanted to highlight that Lucy Lefkowitz and Shana Steingard are also staff at National Wildlife Federation who have a much deeper knowledge of science and policy and like marine spatial planning type topics. And I wanted them here to engage as well. So I just wanted to highlight that as we are going through the intros. Thank you.
Nice. Shana and Lucy, you want to say hi?
Yeah, thank you so much, Bobby and Julia. I'm Shana Steingard. I'm our Senior Policy Specialist on our Offshore Wind team. And I comment on all federal dockets on offshore wind, including in Oregon, and commented on the work that NCOS did on that spatial planning work for the Draft Wind Energy area. I'm really looking forward to this call. I'll pass it to Julia, or excuse me, Lucy.
Thank you, Shana. Thank you, Julia, as well. Thank you all for letting us be here and be a part of this process. I'm Lucy Lefkowitz, she, her pronouns, and I am NWF's offshore programs, or offshore wind energy programs, wildlife policy specialist.
And then let's go Brody and Sophia and then Andy.
Yeah, I'm Brody. I am a master's student at Oregon State University, and I've been brought on kind of as an intern for this roadmap process, so helping Jeff out.
Hey, it's nice to actually meet you, Brody. Welcome.
Yeah, likewise.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sofia Castellanos, and I'm part of the Oregon Consensus team, here working with Bobby, and happy to see you all this morning.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Andy Lanier. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Marine Affairs Coordinator for DLCD and helping Jeff to staff the roadmap effort.
So Rick, Dean, and then Jason.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Rick Eichstead. I serve as tribal attorney for the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lorumquah, and Siuslaw Indians.
Yeah, I'm Dean Apostle. I'm a mostly retired landscape architect and scenic resource expert, part of the Roadmap group.
Jason, you there? We can't hear you. Okay. If it's okay, I'm gonna come back to you. I know you're working on your audio. Oh,
You
we
hear me
got
now?
you.
Yeah, hi, everybody. I'm Jason Bush. I'm the executive director of the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust Poet.
Nice. Let's go Delia and then Natalia and then Mandy.
Morning, everyone. Delia Kelly. I'm the Ocean Energy Coordinator with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Been working in this space for about 13 years, and marine spatial planning is part of my job throughout that tenure. So happy to be here.
Everyone, Natalia Stranatka, submerged cable analyst, Department of State Land.
Mandy McNabb, and I am with DLCD and Oregon Coastal Management Program as administrative support and coastal rulemaking. I'm assisting Jeff Burright with some of his meetings for the offshore wind.
Thanks, Mandy. Kent and then Carrie and then Gretchen.
Good morning, everybody. Kent Mathis, filling in for Kim Peacher. She was double booked this morning. So I'm the Northwest Training Range Complex Program Manager. So up at Whidbey Island, we're just overseeing the offshore water space, equities, airspace, and some terrestrial properties that the Northwest home ported naval units use for their training and readiness. We have already provided input to BOEM that's in the form of call areas. So those areas should already be known to you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Carrie Silva. I'm out of Charleston, Oregon. Been in the fishing industry for over 41 years, so I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Gretchen Bath, and I am in North Carolina. I work for CSS as a contractor to NCOS, and I'm a marine ecologist and policy analyst. And I'm just here as an observer.
Glad you're here, Gretchen. Susan and then Carlin and then Laurel.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Susan Chambers. I'm Deputy Director of the West Coast Seafood Processors Association. I live in Coos Bay. Our headquarters are in Astoria, and we represent most processors in Oregon, Washington, and part of California.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Carlin Yalla, Wasco Yakima. I'm at CRITFIC, Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and my focus is on energy. We are located in Portland with 4 member tribes, and we represent their interests: Warm Springs, Yakima, Umatilla, and Nez Perce.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm on the road.
You sound great.
Great. This is Laurel Hillman, Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, Ocean Shore Resource Coordinator. I've been with the agency almost 20 years and worked on various marine spatial planning adjacent things, including the Marine Reserve process and the territorial sea planning efforts. So happy to be here.
And Gina.
Hi, I'm Gina Carter. I'm with the Nature Conservancy in Oregon, and I'm interested. If you start asking me to name data sets, I'm going to be terrible at that. But I'm really interested in the public participation and intersection in marine spatial planning and the power of proactive planning and helping us think about reducing conflicts and understanding each other's priorities. And so I'm here to cheerlead mostly, and to learn and see how we can maybe bring resources to help this work occur.
That sounds good. But now you've put a challenge on the table. We may ask everyone to name their 3 favorite data sets at the end of one of these meetings. But, Jeff, before I hand it to you to introduce yourself, is there anybody else that I missed? Okay, Jeff, you want to introduce yourself and then tell us what we're here to do and what is marine spatial planning in the context of today and what you're hoping this group can help deliver for you?
All the things, yes. Good morning, everybody. Jeff Burright with DLCD, the Offshore Wind Roadmap Coordinator. This meeting is my fault, but also my privilege, and I'm excited to have this conversation. So, as Bobby mentioned in the opening, this concept of marine spatial planning in the roadmap, from my perspective, it kind of emerged from the discussions we've had so far since November. I think when I started down this path of the roadmap, I wasn't really thinking about where new marine spatial planning might fit, but it was pretty clear from the outset that it's on a lot of people's minds. And so the purpose of these conversations, as I see it, is for us to join our minds and see what we might recommend as a state direction in regards to marine spatial planning. Currently, marine spatial planning in federal waters off of Oregon is a federal process. It has been led by BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and they accept input from the state and other entities as they are identifying these wind energy areas where leasing may occur. I think a question for us to grapple with first off is there a different model where the state might lead? And I offered some links for those who received the email yesterday, where California, New York, I think maybe a couple other states have taken that road where they've said, we're going to look beyond our territorial sea boundaries and look out into federal waters with our own lens and our own lead. And we're going to proactively identify areas that we think would be most suitable. If we think about the mitigation hierarchy, one of those topics we talked about in January, avoidance is the top rung. It's where you start. And marine spatial planning is a way to achieve that first rung and even get into the minimization, that second rung down, before you start thinking about things like mitigating for losses and compensating and correcting. So questions that I would like this group to talk about are, should the state try to take a leading role? And if so, as Bobby mentioned, what would we do differently than what we've seen so far out of the BOEM process? So there's a bit of reflection that I'm asking for here, and also a bit of value and vision setting. I think that this conversation is a scoping conversation. We are not trying to do the marine spatial planning here. And I don't think with the time that we have, where our funding from the legislature runs out in June, I don't think we're going to do it with our roundtable group either. So another thing that I'm hoping this group can talk through is, well, if we do it, what's it going to take? What kind of time and resources ought we to expect? What resources can we reach for? I'm glad that NOAA is here with the NCOS because, you know, the contributions that they made to the BOEM process and the modeling and the multiple layering, I could see us needing something like that. So what does it take? What are the resources and time that we expect? Are there any guidelines for how we ought to be doing it as a process, getting to Gina's points? Who should own it? Who should be the lead of the many different entities who could? I think you'll notice if you looked at the links from California and New York, that the leader of those spatial processes were the energy departments of those states. Is that what we want to do in Oregon, or do we want to do something different? What makes sense for us? So those are kind of the things. And then I also want us to start asking the question of how should we bring BOEM into this conversation as well? Because they have resources, they ultimately have the authority for leasing. Let's figure out how we are all going to work together going forward. So that's a lot for us to work through. And I see Bobby has raised his hand. Go ahead, Bobby.
Just real quick, Jeff, just for some folks that might be new to the roundtable process, what geographic scope are we talking about? Are we talking about the entire Oregon coast in both federal and state waters?
Say yes. So yes, for those who may not be aware, state territorial sea boundary goes from the shore out to 3 nautical miles. Anything beyond that on the outer continental shelf is the responsibility of BOEM and the Department of the Interior to issue leases that would allow uses in those areas. And those are outside state jurisdiction for issuing leases, but they are within the state's review abilities under federal consistency. And so if we were to identify early on some main policy barriers that might make a particular area in federal waters a bad choice, well, that's good information that could, you know, inform decisions down the road.
Yeah, Shayna, go ahead. And then I think, Jeff, we're opening the floor here for kind of initial input on some of those questions that you asked, right?
I am overly excited to participate in this, so please just forgive me for my maybe obnoxious enthusiasm. But I'm so glad the state is working on this because as an ENGO reflecting on this process, I think there's a lot of opportunity where the state can enhance what NCOS is doing because BOEM is limited on what they can look at. And there's a lot of criticism that we've had of the process, although I think adding this process in a transparent way was a great benefit from NCOS. Bobby, on the scoping piece, one of the ways that I think that the state could possibly enhance this process is by looking even broader in scope when they're looking at marine spatial planning and considering the ongoing activities across the West Coast. So of course, you're not looking at where to site in waters that are not off the coast of Oregon, but looking at how species are interacting across the coast. And that would certainly be an improvement to what's currently being done. I think another opportunity to enhance what NCOS did would be to look at transmission as a piece of this marine spatial planning. You'll probably recall that the NCOS spatial planning wasn't able to incorporate transmission because BOEM isn't allowed to look at transmission during leasing, but it's such a huge factor in offshore wind planning that the earlier we can consider it, the better. And then third, I think another limitation from the NCOS version was that there were some time limitations, and I don't think that they had the opportunity to analyze as many species as maybe I would have liked. So an additional data layers on not only protected species, but also like where they're ESA listed or MMPA protected, but also state listed species or state protected species as well, I think would certainly make this a worthwhile effort for the state to take on. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to share, and forgive me for my just like over the top enthusiasm.
So Shayna, in our meetings, you're only allowed to apologize once. So you've already done it twice. So no more apologizing. We're really glad you're here. Gina.
I also just, I'm going to echo Shayna's support for the state taking a leadership role, and I think the state has a good track record of doing some marine spatial planning successfully in a very collaborative, comprehensive way. It took time and effort to get all the voices heard, but it was collaborative. But the one thing I want to add to this dialogue is that in the past, I don't know what the future holds, but in the past, BOEM has said if the state had a marine spatial plan, if there was proactive planning, they would honor it. And they would not do lease calls outside of those areas that had been collaboratively selected. And I think that's a really powerful invitation. And BOEM had said publicly, like, oh, well, the reason we have to do marine spatial planning is because there is no other plan. And so for me, that provides a lot of incentive and motivation for us to do it and offer some paths for BOEM instead of having them impose it upon on us. So thank you.
Yeah, so Gina, you said you supported the state doing that. Which parts of the state?
I mean, I guess I have biases that
Well, of course you do. We all do. That's why I'm asking you to let us know what those are.
I mean, I would support the DLCD leading on it because they do have a thoughtful track record. They're very familiar with the marine data layers, the marine stakeholders. The other agencies, of course, should be welcome to participate. But I think that there's just a lot of strength that agency already has and experience in marine spatial planning. So yeah, that's my personal opinion.
Dean?
Thanks. Couple things. First, I have no experience at all in marine spatial planning, but a lot of experience in terrestrial land use planning and design at very large scales when I worked for the U.S. Forest Service. And I presume, and we'll probably get into this discussion later, Jeff, but I presume marine spatial planning conceptually is the same as doing land use planning on land. It's figuring out what you want to happen in some areas and what you don't want to happen in other areas. And it's using resource mapping and overlays to kind of get at that question. The questions Jeff posed, should the state lead? I'd say absolutely 100%. Yes, the state should lead in this because I have experience in observing what happened on the East Coast with BOEM leading. I think it's created a lot of conflicts, that a lot of overlooked resources when they did the lease areas. And so I think if we're going to avoid that in Oregon, Oregon has to take the lead and then provide some direction to BOEM, particularly on areas that should be off limits to offshore wind development, or if not off limits, where it should be limited. Not maybe not 1,000 turbines, maybe 100 turbines, or maybe 50 turbines instead of 1,000. Yeah, so what would be, I think your other question, Jeff, was what would be different if the state did it, took the lead. I think what would be different is the state would be able to prioritize what resources it wants to prioritize, and to be able to spatially say, here are the areas that are most important to us from a conservation standpoint. I think that's a real powerful tool to have. And I also just add as a side note that the Oregon Terrestrial Sea Plan, I think it's called, has a really good start on scenic resources. So the foundation layer for understanding scenic resources at the coast has already been laid by the Oregon Territorial Sea Plan. There's a lot more work that needs to be done to firm that up and clarify some things, particularly when you're looking at the distance out that it extends. It probably didn't extend quite far enough, but but we've already got a lot of the information that we need to do to at least for that component of resources, scenic resources. We're pretty good shape. Thanks.
Thanks, Dean. And Jeff, if there's any follow-up or things you have, just jump right on in. But then let's go Rick and then Natalia.
Thanks. Sorry, I was finding my mute button there. I absolutely agree that the state should take a role or take, we should do this. As far as what agency, I don't really have a strong opinion on that. And some of the points that I was going to raise have been echoed here. Again, BOEM's statement about if the state took the lead in this, they would defer to that. I think that's very important. BOEM did not listen to stakeholders before, conducting its own efforts here. I think there are factors that certainly the tribe and others asked BOEM to consider in its effort that were ignored, including visual impacts. And I think if the state were to do it, it would be good to have an understanding of, are there areas that folks, for one reason or another, just simply think need to be excluded? And let's talk through those, and is there consensus on those? Is there near consensus on those? And if not, let's take them out and see what does that mean. It could be, we could run some scenarios. So I think there's a lot of ability to really understand where, where should this occur and not, and again, talking to, Dean's concept of, is this essentially akin to a forest plan or a land use plan? I've certainly been involved in both. And, there's been a charrette process where folks can just X out areas where, there shouldn't be timber sales there, or, here's areas where you don't want industrial development in a comprehensive, urban land use plan. So, I think we can do some of the same thing, with this exercise as well.
Hey, Rick, can I follow up on that just a little bit?
Absolutely.
Because I think one of our challenges is going to be that the ocean is a really busy place, right? Between where the Navy is hanging out versus where the fish are hanging out and the whales are hanging out and visual resources. Like the places that don't have an X on them may be super tiny. Do you think that and other folks can chime in on this too, but Rick, I'm going to pick on you first, do you think as part of this work group, without actually doing the spatial planning, we could define some mechanisms for how to navigate just the conflicts we know are likely to occur between uses?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of that, I think we could even mine some of what's already on the public record. Like a number of folks in the EA process asked BOEM to develop some alternatives that would exclude some critical habitat areas. NOAA Fisheries asked for that. I think the state of Oregon asked for that. A number of entities, the tribes asked for that. So I think there's, between the stakeholders already there, as well as looking at what's already been on the public record as far as, what did people ask BOEM to do that they didn't?
Yeah. And I think that's, Jeff, that's our next, I see Natalia, I see you, Dean, and I'll let you go. But then, Jeff, I think that's kind of our next phase of this meeting, right? Is to talk a little bit about how marine spatial planning has rolled out before. So we can be a little even more specific than we are now on like, what do we like? What do we not, what don't we like, right?
Yeah, my intent is to give the spotlight to Andy for a little bit, and he and I will have a little Q&A about what's been done before. I'd also invite folks from NCOS to offer any perspectives from what your experience was like working through the BOEM process. I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot there, but I'm just so excited you're here. So.
Yeah, I think that I'm interested. We just have that depth of expertise and experience. Let's have Natalia and then Dean go, and then maybe we give the mic to Andy. Can't hear you, Natalia.
Yeah, Natalia, you're muted.
You're not muted. It's your audio setting is off. Still, while you're figuring that out, you just might have it set to Bluetooth. I don't know if you have earbuds or something around, but on the audio, if you just check on what your audio source might be. But I'm going to go to
Can you
Dean.
hear me now?
Oh, yeah, whatever you did worked.
Something with audio. It's Zoom, not Teams. Okay, so that's actually interesting last question. Yeah, I would be interesting to know the history and how it was done before the marine spatial planning. But yeah, answering your question, Jeff, should we look behind 3 miles? Yes, certainly. And I agree that DLCD should lead this because you have a lot of expertise and like Andy, he knows a lot of history and other folks. And probably, and certainly we need to do our own research because I remember when I talked to California last year before BOEM decided to lease those areas, they said that, yes, BOEM did own research, but we also did our internal state research so that we have a platform, an option A and B, and justification why we cannot do it this way or why we should do it this way. Probably, you know, we as human beings divide like 3 miles and this number of miles, but ocean, it's water, it's natural flow, there is no wall between 3 miles and the other things, and there is an ecosystem there. But probably if we divided already this, we need to look for what we can do and conditions when any undersea cables or infrastructure entering the state water. So I'm looking like from perspective power cables, let's say, or fiber optical cables or any other pipelines or utility can be crossing. And it's also coming to, if you had this last news in the Baltic Sea when Russian ship damaged one power cables and some fiber optical cables were like not far away from, so it also was affected. And this is critical infrastructure. Probably we can start from here, collaboration, that any communication, energy, water system, considering at the national level as a critical infrastructure, and there is 155 criteria what should be there. I do think that we need to consider separation standards at the state, and it's in our, let's say, authority to decide how much distance should be between those power or fiber optical cables that we know that someone accountable for that and who will be involved. The interesting question, the last one, how should we cooperate with BOEM? I don't know, because now BOEM Oregon Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force is in pause. That was a platform that could be cooperation through that. But maybe we should establish our internal state task force with involvement all state agency, and then we can have authority to invite at least federal agency and other agency if that platform is on pause right now. And under that task force, we can do and discuss what research needs to be done, how we can cooperate, etc. So, but that's a question. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Natalia. Yeah, Dean, and then we'll move to Andy.
Yeah, I wanted to address the X question, Bobby, that I think you raised, but also Rick alluded to as well about the idea of Xing out certain areas that where wind energy would not be welcome. I worked for the Forest Service at Mount Hood National Forest and worked on the land use plan there, and we got carried away. Forest Service got carried away in its zoning of Mount Hood National Forest, and this probably applies to the other 19 national forests in the region. We ended up with something like 46 distinct zones across the 1 million acre Mount Hood National Forest. And it really just got very confusing for everybody about what the hell was really supposed to happen in those zones. But if you looked kind of under the hood, really, if you could narrow the 46 zones down to 3 zones. And the 3 zones amounted to, and this has to do with primarily with timber harvest, because that was the thing the Forest Service was most interested in at the time. That was the landscape changing thing that they were doing was harvesting timber. Three zones: go, no go, go with limitations. That's all you really needed. And when you looked at the 46 zones, they really fell into one of those 3 categories of go, no go, go with limitations. And that's when I look out at the ocean off the Oregon coast, that's what I envision for wind energy, is that there are areas identified as too important to develop. There are areas that are of lesser importance. And even though they do have resources that are important, we're willing to compromise those resources in order to extract that renewable energy. And we're making a conscious trade-off on those. And then the third one being the in-between areas where some trade-off is also we're willing to make, but not as much as in the area that I just described. So that you've got the A areas are the protected areas, the C areas are the go full blast with mitigation, and then the B areas are the resource takes precedent, but you can fit in some renewable energy, some offshore wind. So that's the way I think of it. And then the other question that came up was, I think, Bobby, from you was, does our team actually do the planning? And of course we can't. We're not equipped to do that. We don't have the time to do that. But what we can do is we can describe a framework for the state to move forward with marine planning. And that's where I'm hoping we can get to by the end of this process. And the other thing, just as talk about the elephant in the room, with this administration in place in Washington, is a very good chance that BOEM's going to be out of commission for a while when it comes to wind energy. And so there's I think it buys Oregon some time to go forward with its process of marine spatial planning, knowing that at some point this administration will not be there any longer or may have a change of heart. And so in a way it works to our advantage, but I also think that if we sit around and wait for BOEM to get involved, we may have a 4-year wait on that, because I think they're about to be all pencils up on offshore wind. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dean. Scott, did you want to jump in on this thread of conversation, or did we want to hear what else was going on and then come back?
No, I did want to just comment on Natalia's comment about separation standards, and that I agree with her is something that didn't work in the BOEM process and needs to be updated in ours. And for those that aren't familiar, there's a fiber optic cable that goes through the Coos Bay wind energy area. And while we had asked for some separation, some standards, some exclusion of the cable, BOEM's answer was simply, we're not going to do that. We're going to leave it up to the developer and to work with the cable owner. And the problem with that is, this lease didn't go through yet, but in Eureka, when they had a lease, I believe the lease rate worked out to something like $2 million plus per square nautical mile. So there's a lot of pressure from the developer, or at least on the developer, to maximize the value of their investment. And so to say, we're paying for $2 million a square nautical mile for lease area, and yet there's a cable here. They would, logically want to maximize the use of that area as much as possible. The opposite from the cable owner standpoint is we need room, we need a separation area so that we can maintain the cable that we've already got here. So agree that that's something that should be included in an Oregon plan. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. I mean, it's Jeff, I'm just hearing our folks here have some of those clear criteria and factors in addition to the NCOS analysis of like, hey, these are some other things that need to be looked at if we're kind of building out that framework, huh?
Yeah, I'm hearing that too. And I would be curious to hear from the NCOS folks and BOEM, are there some practical reasons why some of these things we're talking about might not be as feasible as we think? Are there hidden obstacles here that we don't know about?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Shane, if you wouldn't mind just dropping your question into chat, Jeff. I'm wondering if we want to give NCOS and Jessica some space to talk about some of the things they talked about now, or have Andy go first. Do you have a sense? Because you just pitched the question to NCOS. Do we want?
Yeah, I did. Jessica, your hand's up. Say whatever you like.
Yeah, do it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, first just wanted to say thanks again for having me included in this conversation. There's been a lot of great points made so far, and I certainly support a lot of what has been said. I did want to just offer a little bit of insight, I guess, as far as how we felt the process went with BOEM this past time, and there's certainly room to improve upon that. And I would say the most limiting factor to our marine spatial planning process last time was the time constraints. And I think a lot of us here know that, but there was a lot of pressure from the previous administration to sell as many leases as possible within a certain time period. And there was a lot of pressure coming down from DOI and BOEM leadership into the region on trying to get things done as quickly as possible. So kind of leaning on what Dean mentioned, that this might be a great opportunity for the state to get ahead of things for another round of potential leasing in Oregon. Because in order for the process to work well and to be done, I think, to everyone's standards, is to really have enough time, especially for the engagement pieces in this process, because with what happened last time, the compressed timeline did not allow for a lot of community engagement and the additional engagement that BOEM has to do with tribes. So, and it also led to a lot of really short comment periods and did not allow some deep thinking to the public and other stakeholders in order to really understand and respond to some of the areas that BOEM was putting forward. So I do agree. I think this is a great opportunity to be able to kind of start over and use this extra time to plan better and to incorporate more community involvement and input. I also wanted to second kind of some of the points that Shana had made just a little bit ago, especially with looking broader in scope. The work that we did previously, we were constrained to the call area, and to really understand the potential constraints or sensitivities of the region, we really should be looking as broad as possible. And then that way we can better analyze or understand where are those more sensitive areas, and kind of just get a better context of how the region as a whole could be affected, or impacted. And also having the additional piece with time could allow us to add in additional data that before we were not able to incorporate. There have been some recent things going on, especially within NOAA fisheries, to update a lot of data that could be used in our modeling process that could improve it, especially with protected species and fisheries data. And I think that BOEM would have liked to use a lot of that new information that was coming in, but because of those time constraints and pushback from leadership to move forward, we ultimately were not able to wait for some of those things to come in. So, oh, and then I won't hold the mic for too much longer. I did want to mention that I do think that it's a really great idea and consideration to incorporate in some way transmission planning along with the siting of offshore leases. And I think that some of the recent work that NREL and DOE have done, we could potentially incorporate that transmission piece into this planning process. And I know that as our group at NCOS, we have this interagency agreement with BOEM. However, we do fully want to support states in their efforts for marine spatial planning. So we are more than happy to bring in some of the additional support that you may need, depending on which agency within the state ends up doing some of this work. We can certainly offer some additional support for that.
I want to ask Carlin, could I have your permission to have you hold for a minute so I can ask some follow-up questions to Jessica?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Jessica, I want to build on what you just said and see if you could give us a sense of what would it look like in real space if the state were to say, okay, this is our process now, and we would love NCOS's help. I assume that costs some money to somebody. It costs staff time. How heavy of a lift would it be for NCOS to support us, and what kind of support would we be able to have in a process like that?
So I think some of that, in order to get actual maybe numbers or people that could support that, I can take it back to my leadership and kind of get an idea. But we have multiple funding sources, and so for some of this support that we would provide to the state, we wouldn't need financial support in order to do so. It would come out of part of our program funding. But depending on the amount of time that we would maybe expect this project to go on, we could then look at additional sources of funding, maybe from DOE or NREL or some of the other federal money that some of my leadership could help look into. Is that a
Yeah, I'm just laughing at a comment from Bobby in the chat saying, let's do that now.
Sorry, I was like, let's just jump on that offer. It's like, yes, please.
But I think
Okay.
time is an important element to consider, right? Because as I think about the needs for spatial planning out on the outer continental shelf, I think that we're not ready to just jump right in. I think we may need to do some data development, some assessments of existing information. As you said, you know, there are new products that are forthcoming or just recently published. So I think those parts of the conversation may change scope and costs, right? Depending upon how long a process may take and what kind of additional work is necessary for inputs into that process. So I think those are important questions for us to consider as we think about this endeavor.
Yeah, those are good points, Andy. I do want to mention that we also, so when I think of the marine spatial planning process, it also includes that data development piece. So we could provide support during that part of the process as well. And something that we have been doing in other regions to support some early planning is having these data development workshops to gather as much available data as possible before a process starts. And in the past, that's typically something that we've been able to fund through some of our program funding. So it could maybe be a potential thing that we talk about doing in Oregon.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I love the idea of some data development workshops to kind of run through what we have on hand and what may need to be developed to support our broader planning goal.
And Shana, thanks for the comment in chat there on the Louisiana example. Carlin, you want to jump on in?
Yeah, sorry about that. So CritFit published our energy vision, and our energy vision was created to address all of these major energy transition systems, you know, et cetera. And it's energy related recommendation, essentially to protect the tribe's treaty secured fish, you know, everything. And something that I could agree with, everyone has brought it up, is more of a holistic approach. And to the tribes, that would mean how to understand currents more, because our tribes are inland. And I think sometimes people are confused why we're here. And lamprey and salmon are already facing a ton. And for the first time, we're starting to monitor and see salmon aren't coming back to their original spawning grounds. And at what point can it be monitored to where we can see the effects of offshore mitigation on our restoration efforts for salmon? And just more specific comments as well. I can include, let's see here, more of a comprehensive environmental and cultural assessment. I think our cultural species weren't incorporated enough. I looked everywhere on Google, exhausted myself. I didn't see any research on lamprey, not even in the East. And let's see here. Yeah, just and also where and how a traditional cultural exclusion layer could exist, and what that would look like.
Thanks, Carlin. If you have a link to CritFix Energy Vision, are you able to drop that in the chat for folks?
Yeah, I'll do that right now.
Awesome, thank you. Susan?
Thanks, Bobby. I wanted to go back to one of the, oh, it's this slide under what do we need to do first before we are ready to jump in. That bullet, state federal partnership understanding, I would defer to Rick and Carlin, but I think that also should include tribes. The tribes have a lot of data. And I'm looking at it more regionally because I know the tribes in Washington do have a lot of ocean fishing effort. I mean, yeah, they concentrate on salmon and lamprey too, but they're also very concerned about species that may go through from California through Oregon to Washington. So I'm struggling with how to deal with that. I mean, I'm just kind of tossing it out there. We need to look at it a little bit regionally because what we do in Oregon may affect tribal fishermen or commercial fishermen or recreational fishermen in Washington or California. And one other point, what was it? Oh, and the geographic scope. When Jessica was talking about NCOS, I agree. I think we need to look at Oregon holistically before we identify areas. But there again, we also need to consider existing offshore wind farms like in Humboldt. We need to understand the industry better. If we put something in Brookings that is so close to Humboldt, how will that affect the environment, species, things like that? So we do need to do some regional considerations. I'm just not sure how. But anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Jeff, I'm wondering if this is a good time to put Andy on the spot a little bit to talk about some of the past similar planning efforts that have happened in Oregon oceans and Andy, kind of what's worked well and what hasn't. Like what was really hard about it? What contribution did it make? What do you think, Jeff?
Andy?
Sure. I don't have anything prepared. I can, the one thing I would say is that Oregon does have a long history of spatial planning, whether that was thinking about marine conservation areas with the establishment of our marine reserves and protected areas, or thinking about wave energy development back in the kind of late 2000s era, where wave energy was a driver for the need for spatial planning. And we did spend multiple years developing data that were important to Oregon from the foundational principles as described in Goal 19. Right? Goal 19 is the state's ocean resource management and planning goal. It sets out the vision for how the state will respond to proposed new uses in our ocean space, recognizing the importance of our ecosystems that are the foundation of our spiritual, our economic, our other benefits that we get from harvesting ocean resources or just experiencing the ocean through our aesthetic, experience when we're out there on the shore or on a boat. And so we did spend years and millions of dollars developing products that allowed the state to create a framework for decision making. And maybe I will I'll share my screen here with a slide that includes kind of the end framework for what we ended up with when we planned for marine renewable energy the first time, right? So the framework that we built had kind of grades of allowances, right? If we go back to Dean's comments earlier in the meeting, there was a range of kind of standards and thresholds that would be applied to our thinking about a new use in the ocean. And that framework was founded upon the geospatial information that we were able to collect and then integrate into basically, supporting the establishment of these areas. And so part 5 of the Territorial Sea Plan has a gradation of areas. They start on the left side of this graphic, which, there are areas we selected as exclusion. Like we would not, as a state, consider any marine renewable energy development in there. All the way to places that we'd already established or given a permit for testing of marine renewable energy at a small scale. And the underlying information that was used to kind of create the gradation that you see from kind of the application of higher levels of standards to lower corresponded with concentrations of resources and uses that the state identified. So for example, the resources and use conservation areas were established based upon areas with important, sensitive, or unique Goal 19 resources and uses. These were our rocky reef areas, our kelp bed areas, our seabird colonies, our pinniped haulouts, the important areas for fishing. And we spent a lot of time developing and mapping fisheries effort and then translating those information resources into kind of areas where the standards would apply. The resources use management area and the REFSA areas were kind of areas of our territorial sea that had lesser amounts or no discrete kind of resources identified therein, but there was still, some resources there that had sensitivities to, potential different types of marine renewable energy. And lastly, the kind of overlays on top of kind of the map designations that we created were overlays that would apply across the territorial sea. And that included the visual resource overlay and the marine recreation area overlay. So no matter where you were within the territorial sea, if you were a developer, you would have to, one, meet the standards associated with the area designation you were in, but also have this other screen of looking at the planning overlay of your impact to the visual or the recreational kind of uses. So that is a framework that we built, and it was, all of these areas were tied back to information resources that were collected and were geospatially identified through our systems, right? And you could look at each one of these areas, and we had an associated list of the information that was used to support kind of the inclusion in those spaces. And I could spend a lot of time and energy talking about the efforts that we used to get there to support this framework that was developed. Right, so definitions of what is a significant adverse effect, kind of what is a significant recreational community, what are the sensitive areas in our ocean from a visual resource perspective. And these were projects that in some instances took a year or longer to develop, right? There was no visual resource management system that existed before we were asked to develop that by the Ocean Policy Advisory Council. So I'm going to stop the share on this and then maybe flash up one additional slide from a different set of slides. And please kind of bear with me here. This is years old material that I'm trying to pull up so that we can kind of reference kind of the previous efforts, the strengths and the weaknesses and the challenges. So recognizing that we built that framework, that plan, system, you know, it was all, as I mentioned, founded on trying to meet the needs of planning relative to our ocean resources goal. And as we were thinking logistically about how to do this, you know, we did create what we called a planning grid. This was, you know, geographic areas that we could use to intersect resources and then try and come up with an index of how busy or how not busy certain areas were, but they were all kind of built with those principles of understanding our biological areas and ecological important areas, understanding our fisheries, including areas that, you know, we were going to have higher standards associated with. And then recognizing that we had a lot of existing uses and management areas, and we needed to factor those in from the perspective of compatible uses. And at the end of the kind of this framework, we would have some recognition of areas that the state would want to have higher levels of protection on based on Goal 19. And we ran this process through what was a very intensive public planning process, right? Where you integrate the conversation about the information with the stakeholders, right? So the Ocean Policy Advisory Council was the entity that coordinated this effort, that identified the framework that we were going to use, and received feedback on what we'd done so that it could go into an amendment to our territorial sea plan. And so, you know, the principles of public participation in planning, which our statewide land use planning system is founded on, you know, we took very seriously. And as we went through this process, public input was important at every one of our steps. So maybe I'll stop there because it's, I could speak for a long time on kind of what it took for us to get from the challenge of planning for new use in the ocean to a system from which we would evaluate. And maybe my last comment is that because this was a planning process focused on state waters, we had the authority to create the designations in our territorial sea. But I don't think that same process is maybe going to apply out into federal waters because, you know, we don't have the authority to zone federal waters, but I think we can create the framework for understanding the uses, the concentration of uses, the sensitivity and potential compatibility or incompatibility that we have with our recognized ocean resources and uses with offshore wind. And I think that we can do some of those compatibility assessments and uses to highlight places that would be more or less problematic for future development.
If I can just put an exclamation point on what you just said, Andy, that we cannot dictate what BOEM will do in terms of leasing. We have this prior statement that I hadn't heard about till today, that they said they would honor any plan that we give to them. But I think what we can do and what we have the authority and ability to do is to essentially give a heads up via this spatial planning process to say, we're letting you know in advance that if you try to put anything in this area, we as a state have policies that are going to make that a really high bar, or that might make it just not work. And wouldn't you rather know that before you try?
And Jeff, that's where I was gonna ask Andy, like if that's a signal the state could send, like what's missing from what you already did with the territorial sea plan framework, both in terms of process wise or what Dean had talked about in terms of having a marine spatial planning framework. There might be some additional layers and things that come in, but like what's missing, or what worked, what didn't? Could we just use what you have already and just extend it out to federal waters?
Certainly, I don't think we're starting at square one, but I think that there are some additional desires I've heard that can make this a little bit more complicated. One of which is the idea of incorporating kind of transmission planning in addition to, areas that we might find more or less suitable out in federal waters. And so I think, that concept wasn't necessarily a part of the existing framework that we built. The other piece, I think, is that, we maybe know a lot more about the potential effects of offshore wind because the technology piece is more or less standardized to some degree. And in our planning for wave energy, there was no one technology that was really identified as the type of development that was going to come forward. And so we had to build our system in a flexible way to account for that lack of understanding about what the technology may mean. But I think for offshore wind, we have a little bit more certainty in our, and so we could incorporate that into our planning. A great example is our visual resources management piece. We built our model and our data on the assumptions that a wave energy device would not be more than, I think it was 5 meters tall or 3 meters tall, something like that. And the footprints that were developed out into the ocean, like the view sheds from any particular place, were calculated with that elevation. I think we know that offshore wind is going to be a lot taller. And so we have the opportunity now to redo our work with, a height that we might expect, the center of a turbine to be located and a light to be located. So we have an ability to update our products for offshore wind specifically. So I think we can fine tune what the framework that we established in the state waters would be and how it may apply out into offshore waters. The other example is areas of importance to fisheries. We know the fisheries that are more likely to be impacted by floating offshore wind because the infrastructure in the water column is going to be much more problematic for that method of fishing. And so I think we could more easily fine tune how we would define areas of importance to fishing. But that part of the process was, and I think we'll need conversations today that, you know, I don't know that we would take the same approach we did when we were only looking at state waters. So, but in general, I think we have a lot to build on. We have policies and we have resources that the state has identified within our existing plan, and those would apply out into federal waters. And we just need to include the mapped resources that are out there, and we need to identify those other resources of information that we didn't have when we went through the process the first time.
Great. So Jeff, there's looks like there's a lot of folks ready to jump in on this one, so I was gonna just go there, but any kind of guiding questions or places you want to try and direct people's feedback? Because ultimately we want to know, like, what are the 2 to 3 contributions this work group wants to make, right?
Yeah, I would like to see what questions people have and then start steering the conversation toward how do we mature this conversation toward recommendations. I've been trying to capture things that we might want to come back to, some information that we might need to try to go find to support a future conversation. I'd also like to just check in with people who haven't spoken up yet, maybe to see, are there things that we should be talking about that we haven't talked about yet? Things that we want to make sure this group discusses. I just want to make sure we're not missing an opportunity there. And then I guess the thing that was on my mind listening to Andy was, do we know how much it cost last time to do marine spatial planning? And not only for DLCD as lead agency, but other agencies who might need to spend time to be involved, support for those who do participate. That might be an information need we need to bring back to truly understand what we're talking about here.
Yeah, just to respond immediately, Jeff, I would have to go back to do a kind of more thorough assessment. I know that we had external support for much of our territorial sea planning effort the first time around, and that we had, some, external parties who were interested in different elements of the work. For example, the Nearshore Ecological Data Atlas, that the Nature Conservancy partnered with our Department of Fish and Wildlife to lead that project. There were other efforts specifically funded by foundations that we used to do fisheries mapping. All told, I think some of those external funds were on the order of a couple of $1 million over a couple of years. But I think this effort may be a little bit more costly because we are looking at some broader geographic scope, and I think we are also wanting to ensure that anything we do offshore is going to complement what we have in the territorial sea. So I think those elements are going to be a little bit more complicating, but
Louisiana just got 2 million, so just double the amount of coastline, and you should be. All right, let's go to some questions, and I as you're thinking, really do think about, like, what are the contributions that we can make? Like, what do we want to do moving forward? And Kent and Carrie, it looks like Jason Jason, you're still there, just particularly from the energy development and the Navy side. What are some thoughts? So Natalia, and then Dean, and then Laurel, and then we'll go Susan. If folks can be precise with their questions, and then Andy, if it goes to you, also be precise with your answer if you can. Natalia, we've got your audio issue. I'll circle back around in just a second. Go ahead, Dean.
Okay, thanks. I got a couple of things. First, I want to play devil's advocate against my own position, if you don't mind, for a second. So when I looked at, I've talked to Andy and Jeff about the territorial sea plan, the scenic resource component previously. And I think I mentioned this when we talked, but I'll repeat it for the larger group. if you take it literally, what was done in the territorial sea plan for scenic resource conservation, and you applied that to our current planning for offshore wind, which would imply extending the view sheds out much further because of the reason that Andy said about the heights of the devices being much taller. What happens is, I think, at least when I look at the maps and then envision extending that out, is basically we would be excluding wind development from the Oregon coast out about 30 miles, almost 100%, just based on scenic resource impacts alone. And I don't see that as practical. And so what we need is, I think, going forward, if we go forward with a marine spatial planning process, what to me would be different from the process that you used previously is we're going to have to place a more carefully calibrated relative value on all the existing resources, because we have this new resource that we actually want, which is renewable energy offshore in Oregon. If we don't want it, we should just say we don't want it and be done with it, you know, make it easy on ourselves. But if we do want it, and I do, because I think climate change is a serious problem, and offshore wind is going to make some contribution to the solution. If we really want it, then we're going to have to rebalance the existing resources against the proposed new resource, which is the offshore wind. So that's my first note, is just playing devil's advocate against my own position on the importance of scenic resources. Yeah.
Dean, if I can respond, I
Yeah,
think when we talked previously, we talked about a survey of, like, you know, different scenarios with wind energy on the horizon and whether or not certain examples would be visually subordinate or not.
Right.
And whether or not that standard is something that we as the state agreed with. And I think that is a crux of your statement there, right? How sensitive is our view shed to what kind of impact? And the standard that we put in place, I think tuning that would be very helpful, right? Because as you say, I think if we extend our special area viewpoints and they go out in the ocean to the distance that you could see the height of the new turbines, I think you're right. I think there's no place on our continental shelf that the view, you know, would allow with our existing standards. So that, I think, is an important clarification and a need. And Jeff is highlighting the language in our visual resource classes that might need to be tuned if indeed we do want more stratification of our standards out in federal waters.
Yeah, technically visual subordination, which is a reasonable goal, but it's not a goal that's as restrictive as the one that we were actually talking about the other day with the other group, Jeff. If I don't want to be aware of any wind turbines in a particular view from a particular viewpoint, that's not visual subordination. That's actually a higher standard, which we call retention. Or possibly even a higher standard than that we call preservation. So we've got to be very careful about how we approach this in the next round. If we do this territorial sea planning with wind in mind, scenic resources in particular, we've got to think really hard about what areas we're going to exclude based on scenic resources. And if we just simply rank, you know, viewpoints and rank view sheds like was done in the territorial sea plan, and I don't mean to disparage it because I think it was a really well done process that you did, but it showed us, it actually demonstrated to us that we've got a problem here. Because if we want to see nothing but ocean, from all of our key viewpoints up and down the coast. And that didn't even include, I think, tribal viewpoints, which are probably have to be mapped separately. We're pretty much going to be out of business, on wind, except for this little gap there off the dunes. You see that little lighter colored gray. That would be probably the only place, within that kind of zone, because the dunes block so much of the view. You only get the view from the beach, and your view doesn't extend out as far because you're at a lower elevation, basically. So your horizon line is much closer.
Yeah.
So the only other thing I'll add is there was a question about cost, about who pays for it and what's the cost of expense of territorial sea planning. And I'll just say, whatever the cost, I don't know what the cost is going to be, but we only have one coastline and we only have one Pacific Ocean off of Oregon's coast. And so the state has got to find a way to pay for this. I mean, we cannot not do this. It would be malpractice, land use malpractice to not do marine spatial planning, knowing what is coming and knowing what I've seen on the East Coast, the way it's been done there, and the way the lease areas were developed, and it is going to be visually, it's going to be a real problem on the East Coast, a big problem. People don't recognize how big a problem it's going to be, and they won't until it's like half built. And then it's going to be like, oh my God, what did we do? And I'd hate to see that on the Oregon coast, but I'd also hate to see us exclude wind energy altogether. So we've got to find a way to say, okay, we're willing to give up some of that resource for this new resource. And that's going to be a lot of careful public conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. Jeff, Natalia had a question just on the history of why the our territorial sea goes out 3 miles and some in the Gulf go out 9. I don't know if you want to just drop that in chat. And then,
gosh, that goes back to grad school. I don't remember.
Yeah, it's okay. We can also follow up later.
I might be able to answer that real quick. Texas and Florida used to be countries, and they negotiated their own territorial seas as opposed to every other state that was not a country.
Okay. Well, we can chase that down a little bit too. Susan and Laurel, you had hands up and then you lowered them. So
yeah, a lot of what I was going to say was said in a combination of what went back and forth between Andy and Dean.
Okay.
Mostly I was going to say something to the effect of what we did was for offshore wind, wasn't for offshore wind, it was for offshore wave. And so the application of the visual resource standards sort of to the whole coast versus being integrated into those various categories, the PUMAs, RUMAs, whatever, the acronyms that have funny names, wasn't done because we didn't feel like we had enough information at the time, because we had no idea what the technology was. We had no idea how big it was, how tall it was, anything. So we felt, put these standards in place, and then when we have something, we can assess whether it meets the standard. So I think we knew that, and we did talk about wind at the time, but we're like, that's not going to go in the territorial sea. So, just for context, that we talked about it, but the purpose wasn't for offshore wind in the territorial sea when we did the standards. And I think we had some discussions about, could we integrate visual resources into those categories? And we just didn't have enough information.
Yeah,
but we might have more information now. So.
Well, and I think that's part of what I was fishing for is the overall architecture and logic of what was done. Does that still hold, even though we need new data, we need to redo the analysis? There might be new standards that apply.
And there's a lot more information out there about this type of thing. Sure. Like, we were looking for stuff from Europe. Like, I mean, who had done visual resource stuff in the ocean? And it was rather limited that long ago.
Yeah, Jeff?
Yeah, you're actually touching on something interesting here, that if we did marine spatial planning for federal waters, does that necessarily imply that we reopen Part 5 of the Territorial Sea Plan that currently stops at 3 miles? Because the standards are in black and white in the Territorial Sea Plan, but a group spatial planning exercise, in theory, could happen completely separate from that. Is this an integrated action or a separate action? Because this question of how, like, are the standards themselves fine and we just need to update maps versus how connected they are, that might be one to think about.
Yeah, that seems like a big question for y'all DLCD to kind of ponder on for a bit. And then as a group, we can talk about that too. So let's go.
Just
Susan.
the immediate response is OPAC is going to be standing up a working group to help us think through that. And I think that working group can help to tease out maybe the options or the strengths and weaknesses of either approach. Certainly, I don't think we want to comprehensively amend what we have in part 5 now. I think a bit more as changes around the edges.
Yeah. Susan, you've lifted your hand and lowered it twice now. I'm sorry it's taken us some time to get to you. What you got in your mind?
No worries. It was, I'll probably just put it in the chat, but when we were talking a bit ago about data layers, and I just wanted to make sure one of the data layers that we really need some work on is recreational fishing, specifically non-charter. That is a huge data gap and probably should be in the data gap working group, but we just don't have a lot of information on non-charter recreational fishing. In a lot of the mapping efforts that have been done, we use the charter fishing as a proxy, but sometimes those don't always match up with non-charter recreational fishing. So that was all I had. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, Rick.
Yeah, I just want to, Dean's point, do we want to totally exclude areas based on visual impacts? Sometimes, I mean, there are significant cultural viewsheds for the tribe that should be excluded, period. That's not necessarily the whole coast, but that's something that does need to weigh in here.
Yeah, thank you. So Jeff, I'm thinking we spend the next couple minutes thinking about where we want to take this group next. And it may be kind of taking bits from the conversation on like what the key deliverables from this work group back to the overall roundtable might be. I've taken some notes on a couple things I was hearing. I imagine you've got some things in your head already too. Do you want to start with what you're thinking, or do you want to just ask folks?
I'm certainly open. I think that where I'm starting from is, what can the roadmap say at a really high level? And it's, should the state take a leadership role? What are the pros and cons of that? Are there any reasons we shouldn't? Let's make sure that I'm hearing consensus here, but is that real? And do we need to just make sure we're clear? We have a lot of questions around leadership and resource staffing that we could make some recommendations or offer up some challenges that would need to be resolved before moving forward. This question of what do we need to do first, I think was an interesting one as well that the roadmap could speak to. I think a question that we've touched on but haven't really come to any conclusion on is what would be the interstate regional nature of an Oregon-led process. For me, those are kind of the big tent poles. We also have a lot of these lessons learned and like guiding principles for if we go down our own state-led MSP path, what are some key considerations? I think that that's fair game to include in the roadmap to guide that future effort. We've identified, I think, maybe some information needs for this conversation here that maybe, hard. yeah, we can try to come back to the next meeting and see if this affects the things that we're thinking about here. And then we have some kind of wicked questions, some really difficult ones that maybe are worth some more of our discussion time to grapple with and see if there are any kind of dilemma related aspects of this question that the roadmap could either tip the hat to or offer some guidance on, that are maybe worth some more discussion. So, we could take the bones of this and write a few pages kind of within those categories and see what this group thinks. Maybe we need to do a little bit more discussion first at our next meeting and then have something in writing that we can respond to in a third meeting to then bring to the roundtable. I guess I'd leave it to the group on structure there, or you, Bobby, if you've got some ideas. But that's as far as my brain's gone at the moment. I'd love help writing something if we can get there when the time comes.
Great. Kent, were you going to chime in on this next topic?
Well, I just want to offer some thoughts. I've been kind of a fly on the wall. I appreciate the opportunity to sit in. I've been, party to a number of groups like this, and this collaboration and kind of groupthink and is very helpful. I just wanted to offer that, I think you're talking about a state-led process. I think you need to be careful with the leadership title because of the jurisdictional issues. Maybe you go with a state advisory panel or something like that, where maybe your focus is more on the things that are within your sphere of influence. State, getting a collaboration of all the state entities that have equities out there, those stakeholders, because obviously we've talked about the federal process. The federal process doesn't always reach in to those state entities and extract those stakeholder ideas and things. They're focused on more of a broader picture. So we participate in the federal process through the clearinghouse, the Department of Defense clearinghouse, in collaboration with BOEM. So that's how our inputs are going to be fielded. You're not necessarily, from a state standpoint, if you're in a quote leadership road, going to be able to influence those processes and or maybe even request those processes. So be careful about that. So, but I do think it's a good idea for the state to have a plan. Sometimes the first entity to the table with a good idea, wins. So having some ideas written down, things that are either go or no go. We use the stoplight kind of configuration, red, yellow, green. It's simple for people to understand. Basically anything that's being proposed in yellow, we want to sit down and talk about what the impacts and potential mitigations may need to be. But yeah, careful what you wish for with the leadership role. I'd be careful with that, but I do think the state, should have a process to try to bring in as many stakeholders as possible to know what the concerns are going to be ahead of time. With any kind of planning, the earlier you know about potential issues, the easier it is to deal with them down the road. So those are just kind of a couple thoughts I had. I don't think you should look at this as an either or, like it's either going to be a federal led or state led thing. I think, we need both processes because of the jurisdictional concerns. But I think the state, definitely has a place in providing input and their concerns. And, like I said, if you have a plan, that's even better. But just know that because of the realm of the stakeholders, some of the things that you're just considering at the state level, you haven't thought about some of the other impacts or some of the other potential stakeholders. And that's why I think you need both processes. So with that, I'll just go back to mute. Thank you.
Appreciate your thoughts, Kent. And I also just didn't notice that we had a couple folks join us since we did intros. Mike Conroy, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself real quick, and then Alan Alward.
Sure. My name is Mike Conroy. I'm the principal of West Coast Fisheries Consultants based in California. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Pacific Fishery Management Council's Marine Planning Committee and been involved in offshore wind related fun for far too many years now. Thanks.
Fair enough. Thanks for joining us. Alan? We still got you on mute, Alan. And I see your hand up. We'll cycle back around. But maybe Jeff, I can lay out like some of the things I was hearing as a potential kind of what could go like in a one pager for this group to react to next, because I am feeling like there's enough kind of cohesive direction from this group writing something down between this meeting and next for folks to think about. I think could be really helpful, because then if we got that general direction, our third meeting could be like, this is the data development we really want to focus on, or these are the data layers we want to use, or these are the procedural elements, or this is how we want to go back and do it. And Alan, I see you can't turn on your camera or unmute. I'm so sorry, but your chat is working just fine. If you want to type your intro and then any questions you have in chat, I can lift them up for you. But so here's what I think I'm hearing. That there's some momentum in this group towards a state-guided, state-driven, anything but state-led, adjective-driven marine spatial planning process that's holistic, that takes the time and uses the resources necessary, that matches with the unique resource that is the Oregon Ocean. There's an open question about whether that should be done in partnership, direct partnership with Washington and California, but there's certainly some looking at species and dynamics that cross over the Oregon borders. That the framework for that marine spatial planning should probably start with the territorial sea plan framework with fine-tuning additions and other things, but we don't need to start from nothing. We should start with the territorial sea plan framework, but also really incorporate the lessons learned from the NCOS work, that there was a lot of work there, and even NOAA and the NCOS team has new data, new ways of thinking about how they would do that. That regardless of what that framework looks like, there needs to be some focus on data development in the near term. And then there may be some additional data layer considerations and maybe some conversations around the standards that get used to guide where that marine spatial planning is. So, Jeff, if I had to write a one pager for you today, those would be like the talking points that would be in it. And I'm curious what do folks think about that? Is that like, yeah, that would be worth it, or no, that's off base. We need to talk about this more, or anything key that's missing. And then Jason, at some point, I want to pick on you a little bit too, to see what you think from the kind of the renewable energy side. Yeah, go ahead. Jason, you came off mute, so go for it.
Yeah, okay. Well, I have to admit that I've been sitting here on my hands. I have, unsurprisingly, probably to some on the call today who know me and what I've been doing for the last 15 years, I have some serious reservations about a lot of things I heard today. The idea of engaging in a marine spatial planning process again in Oregon after having gone through the first one gives me discomfort. I don't want to do it. It was a 5-year grind, and it was hard, and it was unpleasant. And there are some fundamental problems with that process and with the outcome of it. I will highlight a couple things here. One, we were maybe 4 or 5 years into that process, and no one knew exactly what the outcome was going to be. They didn't even know what exactly we were doing. Andy was working for another gentleman at that time who was sort of leading this. And I happened to be in on the call or the meeting with the governor's office when the governor's office finally instructed that person to find space for wave energy, because given all the stakeholder concerns and the language of the statewide planning goals, his interpretation was that all these were, in his own language, shields against new uses. And It wasn't until the governor's office sat down and said, we are going to find space for wave energy, that the territorial sea plan finally, as a goal at the staff level, began to figure out how to actually make that happen. But that only played out in the last year of the multi-year process. So marine spatial planning historically, I mean, colleagues on the call here today will know that I generally supported that. I don't anymore in general, because I have concluded that, except for states like New York and California, which was the model that you showed, MSP has failed miserably. California and New York are different in some ways for a variety of reasons. First of all, they have tremendous resources, extensive agency personnel who have engaged in this, and the money to do it. And both of those states had as stated goals that they wanted offshore wind. It was part of their portfolio. They realized that they needed it to meet their energy goals, and they wanted it for a variety of reasons. Oregon is very different. Our state doesn't approach energy that way. We don't have a energy commission that thinks through these things and puts forth their priorities and ideas on what the state needs to be doing in terms of energy development. So asking this group and the existing set of stakeholders to weigh in and decide what the future of this looks like in Oregon is like, I've been sitting here trying to think of a metaphor. The best I could come up with is like if the city of Portland decided they wanted to site some electric vehicle charging stations, and all they could ask was the existing petroleum industry where they thought these charging stations should go. Well, guess what? Probably nowhere, because we're all protecting our particular interests that are already in place, and nobody's here to protect the interest of the future. And to me, that is what's really lacking in all of this, including the road mapping process, is there's just a handful of voices of people who kind of think about these things and advocate for clean energy to address climate change, which I'm a climate guy. That's what motivates me here. And there's nobody on this call that I can tell prioritizes that. They're representing, reasonably so. I'm not questioning, but they're supporting their own specific perspectives. And if that's what we do with territorial sea planning or OCS planning, then I expect the results to look a lot like the TSP, which aren't particularly effective.
Jason, a lot of that is fair. I'm going to push you on just a couple of things. One is just making sure we're not trying to represent other people's interests on this call. You may be hearing things or other things, but folks have various interests and they're going to prioritize different things. So I just want us to be careful that we're not trying to assign interest to others. And the second is, like, I heard you loud and clear on what the past experience was, and it was part of why I was asking that question of, if we're having all these overlays and there's all X's and reds and only a tiny bit of green, and I mean, then that may not work. That could be where we end up. I'm not saying it won't, but I'm just wondering, Jason, if there's an alternative to how we get to the kinds of green areas that we need, if not for marine spatial planning, given all the interest that you were hearing.
It's a hard question to answer because, like wave energy, the industry isn't on the ground advocating, right? They're not here, right? Other sectors would seem to be different. And when we're doing these kind of long-range planning things, there's at least somebody there that has an economic interest. It's what their day job is. You're stuck with me and 2 or 3 other people in the state who are thinking about this and sort of can be viewed as advocates, even though I really am more of a climate person. I just view offshore wind as a tool toward that goal. So state. I've asked the governor's office to sort of weigh in here repeatedly. We need to know what state leadership wants at the end of the day, based upon what our energy needs are and what we're hearing from the state energy strategy. Barring that, I don't think you're going to succeed in having much of the industry at the table. They've all extracted themselves from the Oregon market. And we've tried hard to get them to step up and participate. And they basically are saying, look, their staff is saying we're not authorized to engage in Oregon. We don't have the scope to do that. We're not allowed to work there. So so like I said, it's a good question, and I don't have a good answer for you.
You're all right. And thanks for letting me push you on that. We're really glad you're here. So again, the question on the table is, and that was kind of Jason's thoughts, and then but I'm curious what other folks think of like there is some momentum in this group around kind of state driven or guided process, whether we do that with Washington or California, that's holistic and takes the time it needs. It starts with the framework we've got. So curious what other folks think. We'll go Andy and then Alan. We'll give you another try because it looks like you're able to fix your mute stuff. But Andy first.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Jason for those comments about our process and to lift up what he said, which really allowed I think, the Territorial Sea planning process to actually come to a conclusion, which was that we had to have industry input as to their needs from a geospatial perspective. And, the criteria that they used, I think if I remember correctly, we had shallow water devices, we had mid and deep water devices, and there were some criteria used to help the state understand the needs of the industry so that we could actually do the intersections and understand, what areas would work for them and what areas, wouldn't, basically, when we combined their needs with the other identified resources and uses. And that's how we ended up with the renewable energy facility study sites that were the most, the site off of Camp Riley was the shallow water site, and the site off of Reedsport was a deep water site. Not to say that was, I think, what the industry wanted in terms of space, but those two areas are the areas that the state has kind of led with in terms of places we want to see development happen first, if it's going to happen, and then proceed thereafter. But the idea of ensuring that we understand the needs of the industry when we're doing a spatial planning process is key, because without knowing that, it's really hard when we're looking at the other elements of the plan.
Alan, what you got in your mind? And then Jeff was just reminding me just to open up a short public comment period, and then we should talk about when we want to get together next and get that going. Alan?
Well, I might belong more properly in the public comment period since I am a guest here. Up to you.
It's all you. Come on in.
Okay. Well, as a fisherman, and I've been involved in this since 2015. I participated in what's known as the Castle Wind Agreement in California, and now I'm on the 7C Working Group in California, along with Mike Conroy, who's here. And what the dynamic has been ever since the start, once BOEM got involved, was let's have as much wind as we can, as fast as we can. Now, I've had some engineering training, and I know that you don't do full build out on a prototype. And we don't know a lot about what the impacts of this stuff is going to be. And from a military standpoint, they don't know how it's going to affect all of their systems. Environmentally, over and over again, site survey, BOEM has gone with the assertion that there's going to be no, minimal to no impacts with site survey. But we had Arthur Popper testify to the California Working Group that the impacts on fish and invertebrates and embryos, it's never been studied. And now they're doing site survey with these AUVs, and they're using full power, 40 meters above the bottom. I just see a great potential there for things to not get studied that really ought to be studied. So I think the process of marine spatial planning was mishandled by BOEM. And I say, whatever you guys can do is very, very important. These things, there really ought to be a small scale test. We were talking in California, well, the leases that we have, let them run for 5 years so that we can answer some of these questions. So many unknowns. Fishermen have had to imagine the impacts, and you have had to imagine the impacts. We need to get some data to see whether these things are going to work, whether they're financially feasible, whether they're survivable in the ocean. Just so many things that I think it would be really good if as your first priority, if you could give BOEM some areas where they could do put out, 50 square miles, 100 square miles of test, and then let that run. That's my comment.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. And I think especially for our guests here that are active in other states, I think you hear a lot of folks in Oregon are really interested in doing this right in a way that does work for all the various interests that we're trying to make room for. So we're all ears for better ways to do things and lessons learned. And so, Shayna and Lucy and Mike and Kent and Jessica and others, we're just really glad you're here. Jeff, I think I'm gonna just open it formally for public comment. Does anybody have a kind of a more formal public comment that they'd like to make? Feel free to let me know about that in chat. And then I can open up that public comment period. I think in terms of next steps, Jeff and I were kind of bouncing back and forth trying to kind of plant some seeds for like what a 1-page kind of scope what might look like for a recommendation that we could react to ish. Yeah, maybe more than 1 page, but can I get a volunteer or two to kind of work with Jeff and the Oregon Consensus team to craft something for our next meeting to take a look at? Who's interested in helping do some writing? Yeah, Jeff.
Coming off mute because you mentioned next meeting. I know it's still on my list. We need to schedule a next meeting, so just keep an eye out for that. It's on its way.
Jeff, I am going to ask you which week we're going to look at. But real quick, any volunteers to kind of be our brains and help with pens? Sorry, Brody, you were already voluntold to do it. So thank you for raising your hand, but we were going to tap you in anyway. Anybody else from the roundtable? Yeah, Susan? Thank you. And Dean, it looks like you were volunteering as well. Okay, so we got Susan and Dean. That's Julia.
I was actually going to see if Shayna or Lucy was interested in volunteering. I know they're not roundtable members, but I think that they would just have more technical expertise to help out if they have time. So that's I don't want to volunteer them.
Shayna, think about that because I'm gonna come back to you here in just a second. Rick, you came off mute?
Yeah, I'll do it.
All right, right on. Thank you. I couldn't tell if that was Lucy or Shayna that came off mute.
I came off mute. I'm more than happy to help out, and I work. Shayna is my lead, and so if there is anything that I can bring back to her, if she has capacity, I can always do that as well.
All right, cool. So we've got Susan, Lucy, Rick,
and Dean in chat as well.
And Dean. Okay, great. Thank you. And then if it's okay, Jessica and Kent and others that have gone through this before, if we can tap on your shoulder or just give you a phone call and just ask for some thoughts, would that be okay in between? All right, thanks, Jessica.
Yeah, from Kent for sure. And actually, Kim's your main POC point of contact for this, and we enjoy participating in these types of groups.
Great, love it. Thank you. And so the next full roundtable meeting is February 20th and 21st. Jeff, did you want to try and get this group back together one more time before then, or just immediately afterwards? So thinking like the first week in March or something.
I was thinking last week of February, first week of March are looking pretty good. So that's kind of where I would aim for all the working groups in that 2-week span.
Yeah. Okay. So y'all look for a scheduling conversation, and if it really helps Jeff and I, if we get quick responses on that, because we're trying to juggle so much logistics with this group on a short time. So thank you so much for today. Jeff, any kind of closing thoughts before we let folks off?
No, thank you. I think we made good progress today. I appreciate everybody.
All right, be well, everybody. Enjoy your weekends, enjoy each other. We're really glad you spent the time with us and do all you do. Thanks.
Thank you.
Be well.